Hi everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday Q&A. Hope your week is going well. For those who are in Australia, and those particularly on the east coast of Australia, this is not your average Wednesday because of course it's State of Origin Wednesday. So a big week of rugby league for those who follow it. Tonight is the men's competition, and tomorrow, very excitedly for those of us living in Townsville, is the women's competition, which is being held here. So by all accounts, we are set for a very large audience. I think they're looking at the biggest crowd that they've ever had. I think there's about 15,000 tickets sold already, so looking forward to a great night of football. So we hope that Queensland go well, unless you're from New South Wales, of course. So a great topic that came through, a question that came through this week, and I was really excited to talk about this one, and it's quite ironic, the topic, given my circumstances at the moment. So you may or may not be able to tell from what you can see on the video, but I'm in an office in the city. Adjacent to my office is a car park. And for most of the last half an hour there's been cars coming and going, and I've been wanting to do this Facebook Live, but I've been waiting for the perfect conditions. And then also in the building that I'm in, there's a couple of us that share different offices. There's actually someone who's been on a phone call for about 45 minutes, and they have quite a loud voice, so I can actually hear not the content of their conversations but just the muffled tones. So I kept waiting for the conditions to be right to do the live, and I think I've realised, and maybe it's a good lesson, is to think about that if we always wait for the conditions to be perfect, then sometimes we can wait for a really long time. So I've decided not to wait any longer and jumped onto the Q&A. So it's useful, I think, for me giving this presentation this afternoon, because the question that was posed to me was asking about the similarities and or differences between mindfulness and being in a state of flow. Great concepts, and really looking forward to sort of unpacking that a little bit in the little bit of time that we've got together this afternoon. So let's start with mindfulness. So mindfulness is something that has been around as a notion or an idea or a practice for thousands of years. So there's many philosophies that subscribe to this idea of mindfulness, and psychology has been a little slower on the uptake and has been exploring it probably over the last 20 or so years. Mindfulness has been part of what psychology has been interested in. We have looked at it as a concept from other angles in the past. We've looked at things like attention and concentration, but this notion of mindfulness has now found its way into the psychology literature and certainly into the psychological research. It's certainly a topic that I often present on. I will run sessions on mindfulness practice, how it can help you with performance. So it's a great topic for us to look at today. And then we also have the topic of flow, which we're going to talk about as well, which is a specific area of mental state, which I'm going to say to you is, I do believe that that's quite different to mindfulness, but we'll unpack those two things together and have a little bit of a look at them, and maybe it'll give you something to think about in relation to your own performance and your own state of mind at various points in time. But it was interesting that I was waiting for perfect conditions so I could fully concentrate and be mindful, but I am even now struggling because I can hear little whispers of voices through the walls, and so it's distracting me from the conversation that I'm having with you. So I'm going to have to use all my skills to get my focus back in. So when we look at mindfulness, essentially what we understand that to be is an awareness of the now. So what does that mean? So broadly, we understand that humans travel through anything up to 3 passages of time: the past, the present, and the future. So that's all we've got, is 3 passages of time: past, present, and future. And when we are mindful, we're fully engaged in that present moment. So what that means is that in the moment that you're in now, as you're watching this video, and perhaps you're watching it live, or perhaps you're watching it later on the record, is mindfulness is your ability and your awareness of being in the moment listening to this video. So it may also include some understanding about where you're sitting or standing, or where you're listening to this particular video if you're listening to it rather than particularly watching it. So mindfulness is that state of being into what's happening for me right now, and it's that awareness of it. Now, of course, the advantage when we're in a mindful moment is we're not getting drawn into the future or the past. which are useful passages of time, but particularly when we're performing, mindfulness really requires us to broadly be in the now and to be focusing within the now. So what that might mean is, if I was playing golf, at the point where I am approaching the tee, I might have my head in the past. I might think back to a time when I played golf at this course before, on this particular hole, and how did it go, and hopefully I stayed away from the water gods. But I might remember, recall back in time. So my head is travelling back in time, thinking about what club did I use, what were the conditions like, how did my shot go, did it go well, is there anything that I need to do differently. I may also engage in the future, so I might think about what I need to do and where I need to direct the ball as I hit it from the club. So I might be thinking into the future, and I might also be anticipating the course and the actual hole itself, and thinking to myself, well, I know I can normally hit it this far, so today I really want to angle it a little bit to the right, so I position myself well for my second shot. So that kind of thinking is very much thinking into the future. And then, of course, as I step up to the tee and I'm about to hit the ball with the club, is I might be very much wanting to narrow my focus down and be mindful about what I'm doing at this particular moment in time, because at the point in which I'm actually engaging in the activity, what's going to be most helpful for me is for me to have my head in this moment, right here, right now. So that's broadly something that can be quite useful for us. So mindfulness is the ability to be aware of what is happening for you in any given moment. Certainly if you're on a stage performing, that would be a useful thing for you to do. And where we choose to let our concentration travel between the past, the present and the future will largely dictate how successful we'll be with the performance. So being in that present moment is what we're referring to when we talk about mindfulness. Now, there are different variations on how people understand mindfulness, so there might be some people listening to this going, oh, that's not quite how I understand it, and that's okay. I often find if I'm giving a workshop and I say to people, what does mindfulness mean for you, I can hear some very different answers to that. So for some people it is more of a meditation, where you become intensely aware of what you're sensing and feeling in a moment, and trying not to have any judgment around that, those sorts of factors. So that's how some people view mindfulness. For some people, mindfulness is a moment of serenity. So it's tied very closely to things like relaxation and breathing and yoga and maybe even Pilates, those kind of practices where you can really focus on that particular moment and what it is that you're doing. So for some people it gives you that clarity through relaxation, and for other people mindfulness might be going on a roller coaster, which again, whilst that's a high adrenaline activity to do, you are generally fully engaged with the moment when you're on that roller coaster. However, I know my boys took me once on the Superman ride at Movie World there, and I can assure you that for those 10 seconds or however long I was on that roller coaster, felt like forever, but it probably wasn't. I was fully engaged in the moment. I wasn't thinking about what are we going to have for lunch. I wasn't even necessarily thinking about them at that particular point in time. I was just so engaged in what was happening for me. So we know that mindfulness can come into play in moments of high adrenaline, and certainly that fits in really well in the sporting performances, but we also know that mindfulness can be within moments of serenity as well. So that's broadly how we understand mindfulness to be. What do we mean then when we talk about being in a state of flow? So the first thing I'll share with you is one of the first people who talked about this notion of flow was back many years ago now, late 70s, early 80s. I'd need to double check to be exactly sure of what year it was. And it was a psychologist who noticed, and as many great psychological observations come about from people engaging in their own lives. And this particular researcher had a fascination with gemstones. And so he noticed that sometimes when he was looking at his gemstones and exploring them and doing all the things that you might do with gemstones, my apologies to anyone with gemstone specialties out there, because it's not something that I know a lot about, but what I understand is from what he said is he would start getting engaged with the process of working with the gemstones and appreciating them and looking at them and so forth, and then the next thing he knew was a large chunk of time had gone by. So it might be a couple of hours perhaps. He might have worked his way through lunch and not even realise that that's what he's doing. So the notion of flow comes about from that sense when we are fully engaged in a task. The researcher himself, his surname's quite long. I always remember it was always a trick question that our lecturer when we were at university used to put it onto the exam. He used to say, who is the founder of flow? And his first name is Mahalye, which was relatively easy to remember, but his surname was Csikszentmihalyi, which is spelt Csikszentmihalyi. And the only reason I remember it is it was the front of my notes, so I know that is one of the questions in my uni exam that I did get right. So when we talk about flow, what we're talking about there is a full engagement with an activity. And so much so that it feels like people who go through a state of flow will talk about feeling like it's effortless, even though they might be putting in a lot of effort. They might feel like they are unstoppable. They might feel like almost even have an out-of-body experience. So it's something that not necessarily everyone experiences. It typically will happen when we're engaged in an activity that we really enjoy or we're really committed to. So we often see it happen within sport. It might happen within hobbies, in any of those kinds of activities. And within flow, what some people will say, and I remember I worked with a basketballer once. Now, he didn't know the experience he was describing to me would generally be classified by a psychologist as being in a state of flow, but it certainly met all the criteria of the definition, because he was telling me about a time when he had played in a particular game. He was in the third quarter, he had the ball in his hand, and he managed to weave his way through a number of players, almost like they weren't there, sort of a parting of the waters, if you like. And he managed to get himself down the court and then went up for the layup, and the ball, I remember his description of it, the ball kind of released from his fingertips and went straight through the hoop without even sort of touching the rim. And then he ran back down the court, and he just almost felt like he wasn't even in contact with the ground. So that very much sounds like a state of flow. The biggest challenge when you go into a state of flow, for anyone who's ever been in it, is that the moment you become aware that that's where you are, you step out of it. So, and I remember this basketballer telling me the same thing, that he was in this moment and he was feeling, everything was feeling effortless, and then he suddenly realised, and then he felt like the more he paid attention to it and the more he tried to not lose it, the further away it got from him, and then the moment was gone and he realised just how tired and fatigued he actually was. So the notion of flow is an interesting one, but what I would say, and thank you, you know who you are, for the question that you put forward to me, are mindfulness and flow the same thing? I would suggest that they're not, but they're related. So certainly mindfulness can contribute towards a moment of flow, but they are very different concepts. How do you go about experiencing flow? Because I know some people will go, oh, that sounds kind of nice, I'd like to get into that, and I would agree. I think I've probably had it in two experiences. One for me was once when I was swimming, I was lap swimming, and sometimes it can be those more enduring kind of activities, such as staring at the black line along the pool, and sometimes it will take an activity like that, like something that you're really committed to, that you're something really engaged in. The other thing that contributes to the state of flow is your relative level of competency at the task, because that makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you're still building competency around something, it's quite effortful. You have to think about it quite a bit. So usually a motion of flow will come where your sense of enjoyment of the activity is high, but the level of challenge that you are facing matches your skill. So I hope that gives you something to think about today. So flow and mindfulness, they are quite different things. Mindfulness is definitely a practice that is worthwhile, because we know often what happens for us when life is mindless. That's when we often make mistakes. The old classic is, where have I put my keys, or I can't find my glasses, or you've ever driven off with your lunch on the roof of your car, or I don't think that's just me that's ever done all three of those things at various points in time. So mindfulness is a really great strategy and skill for us to build, And one of the things that I would say is that if you want to improve your mindfulness around some of those goals that you're setting for yourself, whether that be, achievement related situations in sport or work or study or whatever it is that you're doing, try and find other ways in your life to be more mindful. Paying attention to the moment, aiming for your mind not to travel too far ahead or too far back, and being in the moment that you're in right now. So mindfulness is a great practice. Highly recommend. If you want any other resources in that area, let me know. It's certainly a topic that we'll be covering within this group. But also the notion of flow by Csikszentmihalyi is it's an interesting idea. It's a unique experience. Not everyone necessarily goes through that flow experience, but it's great if you have. So maybe you have, and maybe you'd like to share some comments underneath the post. And certainly if you've got any further questions or want me to clarify anything I've talked about this afternoon, just let me know. I'd be happy to do so. So have a great week. I hope your footy team is successful tonight, whoever that team is, and I hope the same thing happens tomorrow. And going into a great week ahead. In fact, it's an exciting time for us up here in North Queensland next week, because next Wednesday night is the launch of the women's team for the NRL, the Cowboys. So they've got their launch next Wednesday night, so I'll be going to that. So maybe we'll tie something into part of the Q&A for next week, depending on what the questions are. So I look forward to hearing from you next week. Please let me know along the way if you have any questions. The post always goes out on a Monday where you can click on the link, but feel free to send through a link anytime. And take care until I chat with you again.